the training needs that will need to be in place in key emerging markets for offshore wind up until 2024. And one of those markets is North America. So in today's edition of this webcast, we will be focusing on the US market. So joining us today is Liz Burdock, who is the CEO of the Business Network for Offshore Wind in the US, who will provide some opening remarks. We'll then go to Jakob from the Global Wind Organization, who will go over the critical standards for success in offshore wind. Fong Zhao from GWEC will then look into the US market outlook and the impacts of COVID-19. And finally, Ed Maxwell from the Renewables Consulting Group will provide some key insights and findings from the study that we did together. Before we get into it, I just wanted to here's the report launch. So if you want to scan your QR code here, you can download the report if you haven't done so already. And I just wanted to also draw your attention to GWEC's response hub for COVID-19. We will be addressing the impacts of COVID-19 in this webcast, and we also address it in the report. But if you want the latest up-to-date information on how COVID-19 is impacting the wind industry, scan the QR code there, and you can access our response hub. That being said, I'll hand it over to Liz, who will provide some opening remarks and update on the US offshore market. Over to you, Liz.
Great, thank you, Alyssa. Thank you all for letting us join in this really important webinar focused on the US offshore wind market. I'd like to thank GWO and GWEC for doing the report, first of all, but also including us to get the word out. You know, it doesn't take much these days to remind us of the importance of health and safety. We're all on this webinar because we're all at home, and it's important for us to be safe and to be home right now. So that just really re-emphasizes the paramount importance of health and safety, not only in the offshore wind industry, but for all of us worldwide. I have the privilege of leading the Business Network for Offshore Wind. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it is a national nonprofit located in the United States. We focus on helping build out the US offshore wind supply chain and the US offshore wind market. We do that through education, such as webinars like today, and also helping to create connections with the B2B or even B2 government. We're a membership-based organization with members all over the United States, but all over the world. So those of you who are joining us from around the world, we really do appreciate it. One of the things we do is we follow the market every day, and we report that out to the developments to our members. And if I could go to the next slide, I just want to briefly show you where we are in the United States. Many of you have seen this map already. It's the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management leasing areas that have been leased by developers, which are 15. It includes some that have not yet on the West Coast, and a few on the East Coast, the New York Bight, that have still not yet been auctioned for lease. Even during this really unprecedented level of economic uncertainty, what we have seen here in the US is we've seen states reaffirming their commitments to clean energy policy and goals. In the middle of this crisis, we saw Governor Northam from Virginia sign legislation that included 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind. If we can go to the next slide, that would be great. We also saw New York's Public Utilities Commission give NYSERDA the approval to move forward with a second round bid. So where we are in the US, we stand at just about 29 gigawatts of offshore wind state commitments. And what that means is that states have actually provided a financial mechanism into law that will support the offtake of that amount of offshore wind. So these actions really do suggest that the state energy policies are going to remain in place, and that they're going to be a vital part of a state or even a locality's economic toolkit to get our economies moving again. And we're definitely going to need them. I want to go to the next slide, if you would. I know some of you may have heard that some of the developers in the United States have pushed back their timelines on some of their projects. But I can tell you that we are on track to deliver still 4,500 megawatts of offshore wind in the next 5 years, with another 4,500 after that. So I'm confident that we're going to be delivering at least 10 gigawatts of offshore wind by the time the decade is over. We also had the virtual IPF last week, which seems like a lifetime ago because it seems like all the days run together in this shelter-in-place world that we live in. But we had a panel with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Jim Bennett, who leads the offshore wind program there, committed to the industry and said to the industry that they were on track to approve the Vineyard EIS in December and continue to be on track to move the 7 construction and operations plans that are currently under the review through the process. So we feel pretty confident about this, 9 gigawatts of offshore wind getting approved. I will say too, and this leads us back to where we are, when we think about delivering these projects, we automatically have to think about worker safety and really making sure that our workers are safe onshore and offshore. So that's why this is so important. We also had another panel during the IPF virtual last week that talked about offshore wind incident reporting and investigations procedures. And you might ask, well, why? You have a pretty nasty industry over in the US. You only have 30 megawatts installed. Well, we've already had a safety incident. So these are things that we are currently right now grappling with. And so that's what makes the work of GWO and GWEC so important. So again, I really want to thank you for doing this. I want to thank you for co-hosting this with us to the US audience. And with that, I will turn it back over to ELISA.
Thank you so much, Liz. As you mentioned, health and safety is hugely important. And that's something we cover in the report, the need for health and safety standardization and training. So now I'll hand it off to Jakob, who is CEO of the Global Wind Organization, who will provide more insights on that topic. Over to you, Jakob.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thanks for this introduction, and thank you for joining us today, all of you. Special thanks to you, Liz Burdock, and the Business Network for joining us and co-hosting this for the US market. We are, all of us, working at wind energy associations, and we're committed to working together for the industry. And I think that's today's webinar is one of those examples of that. We're really pleased, at least, to working with GWEC and to present this first output of our partnership, this report on workforce training needs in the offshore wind sector. I'll leave it to Ed Maxwell from RCG, who's done most of the math here, to go through the details of the report and how we reached our conclusions. But for now, I'll just explain a little bit about Global Wind Organization and who we are and what we do. The next slide, please. Oh, this is the slide, sorry. So GWO is a non-for-profit founded by wind turbine manufacturers and owners. Our members are the world's largest manufacturers and operators of wind turbines on and offshore. So we strive for an injury-free work environment in the global wind industry in setting common international standards for safety training and emergency procedures. We do this because safety is personal and without borders. And as I say in the introduction to this report, every global industry must apply standards wherever it can. We published the first basic safety training standard in 2012 in response to a global demand for a recognizable standard for safety training in the wind industry that could be mutually recognized across the industry. Today, over 90,000 people have a valid GWO certificate. So most of those 90,000 people take the core modules that you see on the screen. It's first aid, it's working at height, manual handling, and fire awareness. And technicians that are going offshore will also add the sea survival as a task-specific element. The benefit here is that for employers and for large projects like offshore wind projects, is that when you recognize GWO standards, those are significant benefits. You can validate technicians' training by looking it up in the wind industry database. We call it WINDA. So every person with a GWO training has a unique ID. I have one myself, and a lot of you have, and we have kept it real simple. So it's just the WINDA ID. Let's say when a technician tells their employer the WINDA ID, this employer can look up your credentials online and verify the training status online. If the records are valid, there's no need to spend time redoing the basics of training, and there's no need to verify a piece of a PDF paper or something like that. The result is that in our surveys with our members and other employers in the US as well, that employers save on average about 5 days per year per technician. So 5 days per year per technicians in not doing training and repeating training unnecessarily. That's a lot. That's actually 2% productivity increase. That workers and that during that time they can be on site instead of completing or duplicating training they already have. Next slide, please. I just wanted to cover this as it's part of our story right now. And the last slide was from the sea survival training, where you could see at the picture that it's very much hands-on training. But you'll know that when you've done like a first aid course or something similar, skills you learn, they tend to fade in the memory. And a lot of the practical training is body motion function. So you need to retrain that practically. It's the same for everyone. So that's why we require workers to retrain their safety training every 2 years. Of course, in this situation where most of us are stuck at home, as Liz said, and we can't travel right now, and the wind power workforce has a huge responsibility to keep our turbines spinning. So it's only right we keep them safe while they're doing this during COVID-19, and we've had to come up with some new ways to train them digitally when most of the training centers are closed. If you have questions about those things, we can talk about that later in the Q&A, but I can also say we've had a lot of training seminars on our new module called a BSTR partial, online partial, that can help bridge this period where you cannot travel to a training center. Next slide, please. Liz, yeah, thank you. So today we have a network globally of more than 350 GWO training providers in 43 different countries. Each one of them are independently certified to our requirements and to our focus on quality. That means that when you train in any of these centers, you will get a training that meets the minimum standard everywhere. We have new markets opening up all the time. Particular North America is opening up really for GWO. It grew by about 90%, 80 to 90% last year. And this is why we have partnered with GWEC to produce this report. And we're partnering with Liz Burdock and the Business Network to give you this webinar. And the offshore wind sector has a unique set of requirements for workforce training. And the sea survival module was created to reduce the risk of injury in the transfer between vessel and TP and back from TP to the vessel. What does that mean? But what does that mean for you if you're a maritime college here in the US and you run a workforce training fund for a trade union or whatever? How many people are actually going to be coming through your training center if you become GWO certified? And that's the question we get a lot when we talk to training centers on the East Coast. Hopefully this report will provide some answers to you. That's at least the intention of it, that we help you in your decision-making process to invest in a new training center and be part of the supply chain for offshore wind in the US. And with that, thank you, and back to you, Liz, ELISA.
Thank you so much, Jakob. As you mentioned, offshore wind is an emerging industry, and in this report, why we did this report is because we often got asked how much workforce do you need trained to grow the industry, and we based this report off of GWEC Market Intelligence Market Outlook up until 2024. So to introduce that outlook and present it, I'll now hand it over to Fong, who is Strategy Director here at GWEC. Over to you, Fong.
Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon or good morning in the US. So as Jakob mentioned, GWO and GWEC, we co-developed this Power the Future report, and as a partner, we're happy to join this webinar dedicated for the US market. Maybe some of you on the line already know that GWEC released the Global Wind Report on 25th of March 2020. In our annual report, we present the data. So looking at the global wind installation onshore offshore last year, 2019, is absolutely an awesome year. The highest installation on the annual level after 2015. That's the best year in the wind industry. So looking at the next 5 years in our outlook, next slide, where you can see in our Q1 global market outlook, we believe that based on the installation range in the world, the two largest markets, US and China, 2020 is supposed to be one of the best year. And so onshore offshore together, we believe there will be more than 75 gigawatts. That's a tremendous growth. However, everything has changed simply due to the outbreak of the coronavirus. So from the next slide, where you can see on the global map, first the crisis start in Wuhan, that's Hebei province in China. It's bring a lot of destruction for the supply chain or project execution. But luckily, China get the virus almost under control within 2 months. As of today, when the Chinese switch up for the May Day holiday, looking at the situation, basically they are switch almost everything back to normal. That's a good sign. But unfortunately, here in Europe, specifically Italy, Spain, are still struggling in the middle of the crisis, even though some of the countries, including here, we are based in Denmark, slightly open, but we're not completely bring life to normal. And also follow the pandemics in Europe, and we got the challenge in India as well. That's the second largest turbine manufacturer center or hubs after China in APAC. Moving on, also we saw the same challenge across the states in the US. We have factory temporarily halted the production. For example, the blade facility of LM, now owned by GE Renewable, they have to temporarily close the factory for 2 to 3 months. So in general, on the map, you can see we have the top 5 global market in terms of cumulative installation. Apart from Germany, I think we have a lot of challenge in terms of disruption of production and the supply chain in 4 out of the top 5 market. Therefore, as of today, on a high level, GWEC basically believe that there will be around 15% of downgrade in terms of forecast we made in Q1. However, the primary impact, it's not for both onshore offshore. The key challenge here, what we believe, is for onshore wind specifically. Looking at offshore, next slide, please. Looking at offshore in general, GWEC maintained our Q1 forecast for 2020. The reason is simple. In Europe, we have relatively a low year 2020, and project, even though during the pandemic, project construction work is still going on in the key market, like in the UK. We just have the largest East Anglia 1 project completed, built it this week, and also construction work moving on quite well in Belgium, the Netherlands, also in Germany. Back to the second largest offshore market, regional market, that's Asia Pacific. We believe that for 2020, the majority of the installation will be in China. As I mentioned at the beginning, luckily, after 3 months of temporarily challenging, the entire local supply chain construction work has come back to normal. GWEC Webcast, where we have the local speaker from China, indicate they are running full steam, make sure that it will get the last in Q1 back from the rest of the 3 quarters. And we also believe that the installation will be offshore project will be built in Taiwan, Vietnam, and Japan and South Korea in 2020, but the volume is relatively slow. In Taiwan, for example, vessels has already left the harbors here in Europe with the component and the turbines to Taiwan. We believe that project will be built according to the schedule. Similar situation in South Korea and Vietnam, where they have the construction work, but the volume is relatively low in 2020. And in Japan, there is no construction until 2022. Therefore, APAC, we remain our focus. For US, for 2020, it's the same situation. We don't make any change because the news indicate that the 2 SGRE 6 megawatt DD turbine has already safely arrived in Canada. So we believe that the project will be online according to the original schedule for 2020. But what could be a situation or challenge on the US wind industry in terms of COVID-19 impact? Let's take a look at the next slide. This slide, that's a forecast based on our GWEC market intelligence, the project pipeline. So according to the project developer, we aggregate each single project announced by developer. So looking at the project pipeline where we have the announced commission date, we end up as slightly over 10 gigawatt. Those projects supposed to be built by the end of 2026. So out of this 10 gigawatt project pipeline, looking at the schedule, around 5.7 gigawatt to be built in the next 5 years, including 2020. So looking at the near term, as I said beginning, 2020, our focus remains the same. Project will be built. It's a small demonstration project, no problem at all. 2021, looking at the forecast, there is no project supposed to be built anyway. So 2020, 2021, relatively safe. However, this doesn't mean that there is no challenge at all for the US. We do see challenge. Actually, follow the news earlier this week, Ørsted, the largest offshore wind farm developer in the world, they are also the big drivers in the US offshore wind industry as well. They made some comment and the announcement. They made it clear due to the challenge of the permitting procedures caused by the COVID-19, they have to postpone one of their project in Maryland, this skipjack offshore project, 120 megawatt from 2022 to 2023. So from the slides, you can see we have already reallocate this 120 megawatt from 2022 to 2023. So the chart basically right now reflects the current situation. However, we also get a warning from the largest developer, Ørsted, that there is potential risk that probably some other project, at least from their pipeline point of view, may under the risk of the further delay. For example, they have the South Fork project, they have Revolution Wind, they have Ocean Wind, Sunrise Wind project in New York as well. I think for now, previously when we look at the challenge, we're looking at the supply chain, etc. So for the US market, because offshore wind is really still in a stage of the project execution, many local or federal permit need to be done before the construction work can be done. So therefore, medium-term wise, there are still a lot of challenge. We saw the delay in New York in terms of the second offshore wind solicitation, even though there's not going to have immediate impact for the near-term forecast before 2024, but still there will be some impact after that. So in general, as I said, near-term, we don't make any change, but potentially we have out of this 5.7 gigawatt, potentially 1/4 of this total installation probably will be impact due to the coronavirus. So we're still close following the market. We will bring in this country by country outlook summertime in our Q2 forecast. So that's the overall situation in terms of the market outlook and the impact of coronavirus. Back to you, Aisha. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Feng. I'll now hand it over to Ed Maxwell from the Renewables Consulting Group, who was our research collaborator on this report that we've published. And he will provide some more insights on how we came to these numbers that we published in the report. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you, ELISA, and good morning or afternoon to everyone listening and watching today. I'm Ed Maxwell, Senior Associate at the Renewables Consulting Group. I'm based in London, but RCG has an established and growing presence in North America. We have teams in both New York and Vancouver, and we've been heavily involved with the development of the offshore wind industry on the east coast of the US over the last few years. We were really pleased to work with GWO and GWEC on this report. Our main role was to undertake the data analysis and the interviews, the findings of which you'll see presented in chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the Powering the Future report. I'm going to use the next 10 minutes or so to provide a very brief summary on the approach that we took to the analysis and some of the key findings. There's of course much more detail and insight in the report, as I'm sure many of you have seen already. Our analysis was essentially split into 2 main parts. The first was simply to summarise the sea survival training that was completed in Europe between 2017 and 2019. The second, which I'll go on to talk about shortly, was to use that training data to estimate the number of trained personnel that have been required to install each megawatt of offshore wind capacity in Europe, and then apply this figure to estimate the workforce needs in the emerging markets, which of course includes North America. So the first part was a relatively straightforward numeric analysis of the data. It's important to note at this point that the report only looks at offshore wind, and therefore we used the data on GWO sea survival and sea survival refresher modules as a measure for the number of personnel trained to work offshore. So when I talk about training, excuse me, I'm solely referring to the sea survival course. Next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, could you just pop one back, Elisa? Thank you. The map that should be on your screens now shows the number of sea survival courses delivered in each European country where there are GWO training centres. As I said before, this was for the 2017 to 19 study period. And these are the 3 full years for which we have a complete data set from GWO's Winder database. By some margin, the highest number of sea survival courses were completed in the UK, with large numbers also seen in other markets with large offshore wind sectors, so Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands in particular. There's training activity across Europe, even in markets such as Poland and the Baltic states, where there is no offshore wind capacity installed or under construction. Now the next slide, please, Alyssa. Thank you. So this table shows the same training data alongside the capacity installed or under construction at the end of 2019, and we use that as a measure of the overall market size in each country. And we can see a broad correlation between the two, although the UK and Germany perhaps appear not to train quite enough personnel for the size of their industries and maybe rely on expertise from elsewhere. Countries such as Poland and the Baltic states, as I said before, and possibly being exporters of personnel to projects in Western Europe. And that really illustrates the sort of integrated nature of the European industry that clearly benefits from the free movement of competent people between the member states and between various projects. Next slide. So over time, training completions have in general increased year on year. We saw an increase of more than 50% over the study period. There was a notable slowing of that increase between 2018 and 2019, and that perhaps indicates that there was some stabilisation of the workforce, or that we'd reached a critical mass to support all the projects under construction simultaneously. It will of course be interesting to see if we have another spike in 2020, COVID-19 aside, as all the certificates that were issued in 2018 will require renewing at some point this year. And there were some other key points that emerged from our analysis. We don't have slides for these, but of course there are many more tables and graphs in the report. But there's a notable annual cycle to the training data, where training peaks in Q1, where offshore activity is generally a minimum due to weather restrictions. And then the training subsequently decreases in the following quarters as offshore construction activity picks up. So in the longer term, that might be an important consideration in the US when planning the demand and supply of training. Next slide. I just want to briefly touch on training providers. The data shows there's considerable variation in the number of courses being delivered by each training provider. So the top 10 providers together accounted for about 2/3 of all the training modules delivered. And in fact, the top 3 account for more than 4 in 10 of the courses delivered. The others category that you can see on this chart here consists of a further 58 smaller providers. Some are delivering literally just a few dozen courses over the 3-year study period. So there's a big range of large dominant suppliers down to some very small ones that do training much more infrequently. The number of training centres in each market roughly corresponds to the size of the offshore wind market, with the exceptions that I mentioned previously, particularly in Poland. Of note here, I think, is that in Germany, training is concentrated with the small number of large providers. The UK, for example, has more providers, each training fewer people, but that may well be due to the dispersed geography of the offshore wind projects in the UK. I think an important note for this session is that in Europe, training is dominated by private training specialists. There's only limited involvement by technical and vocational colleges. But in North America, we're expecting public institutions to take a much bigger role. Already, the Massachusetts Maritime Academy is primed and ready to launch its GWO facility in New Bedford. And as I understand it, there's similar colleges up and down the eastern seaboard that are looking to follow their lead. The trade unions will also play a major role. I think it's been mentioned already, but the unions represent thousands of electrical workers and construction industry personnel, with training a big part of the value to their workforce. So GWO will be a good fit for them. So you should expect many of them to develop courses for offshore wind when the time comes. Now, of course, this is useful analysis of the spread and reach of sea survival training, which is becoming the industry standard in Europe. But the underlying intent of this report was to help forecast the number of trained personnel that might be required to deliver the projected pipelines in the major markets that Fung described earlier on. And we can use the data from Europe to estimate this. Of course, the word estimate is key. There are a few limitations to this, which we do set out in the report. But I want to focus on the data here. So next slide, please, ELISA. So since we only have data for 2017, 18 and 19, and that is mainly due to the 2-year validity period of the sea survival course, it's only possible to accurately estimate the size of the workforce for the 2019 calendar year. We did this by counting the number of live winder IDs, so the number of people that had a valid sea survival training against their name at the end of each month. As I mentioned before, there are a few limitations to doing that and making that assumption, and they are all areas for further research. But we do believe that sea survival completions is a useful and a valid indicator to estimate the workforce size. And it's an estimate that we can refine as we accumulate more data and perhaps study some of those caveats in a little bit more detail. And our calculations show at the end of 2019 that the European workforce had grown to just over 25,000 trained personnel. We then removed about 2,000 personnel who we estimated were involved with O&M activities on operational sites, so that we were just left with a construction workforce. Dividing this by the capacity that was added in 2019 and adjusting the data to reflect that construction phases are typically, multi-year, we derived a figure of approximately 2.5 persons per megawatt installed. And this figure is likely to include those involved in foundation and cable installation, as well as turbine erection and commissioning. So I just want to be clear on that this looks at the project as a whole, rather than just turbine installation. And on some projects, the data will also include vessel crews, possibly even those conducting pre-construction surveys. And it's likely to capture client representatives, environmental and health and safety personnel, and others. So it's not purely turbine technicians. We are looking at the whole workforce required to get this capacity in the water. And we can then apply this estimate at 2.5 megawatts per person, per megawatt figure, to the forecasted installations in the key markets and derive a workforce requirement to deliver that growth. And next slide, please, Alyssa. Thank you. And we can conclude that to deliver the 31 gigawatts forecast to 2024 in all of the emerging markets, about 77,000 people will be required. And for the 5.7 gigawatt forecast for the US, we're looking at over 14,000 people. Now, these people will not all be needed immediately, and some of that figure will reflect efforts to address the workforce turnover that we have seen in Europe, and we assume will be replicated elsewhere. We've also not adjusted the figures for specific local conditions, although we do note in the report where local factors could impact on the workforce estimate. We should also note that this only covers installation, so even more trained personnel than this 14,000 figure will be required for operations and maintenance. So 14,000 people, less than 5 years, and that's just in the US. And that's really our key headline from the study. Put simply, it's a huge opportunity both for GWO and its training providers, including new providers looking to enter the US market. And that headline really concludes this very brief whistle-stop tour of the data analysis that we did for this report. I've deliberately kept the comments brief. We want to keep some time available for Q&A that will follow shortly. So more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. But for now, I will hand you back to Alyssa.
Thank you so much for that, Ed. We'll now start the Q&A session. There's still time to put in your questions if you haven't done so already for our panel to answer. I would just ask when you're asking your questions to keep them brief and just introduce yourself and what organization you come from, and then ask your question. So the first question we have here is from Chris Parker. Chris, are you on the line? Hello? All right, you might be having some trouble connecting, so I'll just read out his question for him. So Chris's question was, what is the level of engagement with offshore oil, gas drilling equipment companies to work to drive the offshore wind industry forward? So that's a really good question, Chris. That's a really good question. I don't know, Liz, do you maybe want to take this one up in the US context?
Sure, I'll try to answer that. Just looking at the network's membership, we have about 40% of our over 400 companies are from the Gulf Coast region and work in oil and gas from Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and even Mississippi. So what we do hope that oil and gas companies take a hard look at offshore wind, especially now, into diversifying into the offshore wind sector. We think it's a great opportunity for them, and we want to work with them. They have the best expertise in our country to contribute to delivering all of those, close to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind in the next decade, and we'll need them. So it's important that if they're not engaged, that they engage, and we'll make every effort that we can to get them engaged.
Thanks for that, Liz. And maybe from the GWO side, is there any sort of collaboration when it comes to health and safety training? Because there is quite an overlap there.
Yeah. Okay. So the offshore wind standard, or the sea survival training standard, was developed in the absence of something that was perfect fit for wind. There are oil and gas training standards that are similar or have similar titles, but they do not really cover the same elements of a transfer from a dynamic vessel to a fixed TP. So yeah, but there are some overlaps. That's true. Just directing to the question, will we see oil and gas drilling companies and equipment companies work in the offshore wind going forward? Yes, of course, and that's what we see in Europe, a lot of it. And the people that work, and also the people that transition from oil and gas or from other marine construction, those are the people who have previous skills that they can bring in, and that way we can assess those skills. And most of those skills are applicable for offshore wind as well. So we'll see that, yes.
But Alicia, I can confirm. I mean, we're talking about the emerging market like the US. I think the number has indicated, at least for new market in APAC, that's the second largest region after Europe. We can see a lot of new jobs has been shipped from oil and gas industry in China, most recently in Taiwan, in order to create local jobs, not just in Taiwan, China. Actually, company from Singapore working in the oil and gas industry, they are trying to win contract in new market like Taiwan, also in Vietnam. So that's absolutely opportunity over there. Thank you.
Thanks, Fong, for that. We now have a question from James, who's on the line. So James, introduce yourself and ask your question to the panel.
Hi, so I'm James Rogan. I'm from SUNY Maritime College located in New York. And we are a maritime training provider. We're a college that educates future third mates, third assistance engineers unlimited. And we also educate the industry at large. So we were talking about like training before and transferable skills. So my question is regard to that GWO training of sea survival, firefighting, and first aid. The American Merchant Marine through the U.S. Coast Guard and being signatory to the IMO has established sea survival training, firefighting training, and first aid training. Yeah. Is there any recognition of this like training? Otherwise, the workforce would have to almost be double redundant, having to take U.S. Coast Guard courses at times, in addition to the GWO courses. Okay. So that's where my question lies.
Okay, thanks, James. That's a good and very relevant question, which is the same in Europe, where SCCW training for mariners is quite normal. Sea survival, GWO sea survival training. First of all, in GWO, if you deliver a similar training at the same time, that's fine by us. Yeah, so you could double and give double certificates if you do the same, basically the same learning objectives. You cover the same topics, you can give it to both organizations. That's fine by us. So that's one way of addressing this. Then the next thing is, sometimes the offshore wind industry, at least in Europe, have had a tendency to require sea survival, GWO sea survival of personnel who really have a relevant training in advance, and they come with something relevant and they haven't recognized it. For instance, for divers or things like that, the training is created for people who are touching the turbine, or going to a turbine, transferring from a vessel to a TP and going back, the sea survival training. It's not for sea survival for marine staff or vessel crew or so forth. So there is an option here for either that workforce or for the developer revisit what are the requirements that they put to their workers. Is it really necessary to put sea survival, GWO sea survival to those workers if they are vessel crew, if they work in the port, if they work on vessels that are never touching the turbine? I would say that there's a scope for not doing that training really. And then the last comment on this is, yes, we have a program we call called merit assessment. So if you're a worker or if you're an employer and you have a team of people who already have a number of courses that they transfer in from a different industry, we can create a merit assessment for those people, but it requires a training center or the employer to document their previous training against the standards. And so we don't have a list of OPTO sea survival, yes, check, because OPTO sea survival, only half of it really covers. So there would be have to something else. So if you can demonstrate that you have covered all of it, we can do a merit assessment, and there's a program for that as well. And we're not about duplicating training, we are about the opposite.
Yeah, so that's great to hear. So as long as the auditors within the US understand that, and when we go through the audit process, that's great to know. And then also, as long as it's, mentioned to the companies involved.
Yeah. So for you as a training provider, I think specifically, the interesting bit is you can deliver several trainings at the same time, and you can help your customers merit assess and bring in like training into a merit assessment program. And we can talk about that offline, James, if you want.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Thanks, James, for that. Next question we have is from Ross. So Ross, if you could introduce yourself and ask your question to the panel.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Ross Gould from Workforce Development Institute. We're a New York State-based not-for-profit, working to grow and keep good jobs here in New York, but also would like to build the industry regionally for the U.S. as well. Just about two questions, really. First, I know that not every person working in offshore wind needs to get a GW certification. So we're just trying to get an understanding of what percentage of the workforce, the offshore wind workforce overall, has GWO certifications, and where generally is the line drawn between workers in the industry that do require the certification and those that don't. And then a second question is, in our current situation, we're seeing a lot of us all working from our homes at the moment, and training is moving online. What type of thoughts are you looking at for making more training available online to workers? And I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, so percentage of workers who get sea survival training. In the established market, 100% of everyone who goes to an offshore wind turbine or part of an installation, they touch a turbine, will have a sea survival. And then in addition to that, I think as Ed pointed out, some other groups may be required to do also sea survival. So if part of, I'm contradicting myself a little bit, but if the vessel crew, if a vessel that relies on using the transition piece as an emergency response plan, so you, instead of transferring from one vessel to another, you rely on transferring via the TP, then a sea survival course could be mandated by the duty holder. Yeah, so there could be instances where people who are not directly working on the turbine will also be required to do it. And of course, inspectors, auditors who have to go travel there, they will also have to have this course, usually. So that was your first question.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. So if someone was doing third-party verification work, they may be required to get a GW certification because they would be touching the turbine, or
most definitely, and they would probably also be required to have a first aid course and so forth. Generally, everyone who travels on a vessel, an industrial vessel, would be regarded as an industrial passenger, and they will need to have a much higher level of safety competency than a normal passenger on a vessel. So they will be required to do some basic safety training of various kinds. So you asked about online. which is a good question these days. We have released as an interim measure a standard called the BSTRP, the Basic Safety Training Refresher Partial, and it's relevant for people who are already within the GWO scheme, and they need to refresh the training. So it's something that goes on in a virtual classroom, basically like this. So we're assuming the target group that are running out of their validity, and they still need to work, and they still need to help us get the turbines spinning and maintain them spinning. What do we do about those guys that cannot travel to a training center to refresh? So we've created this standard that allows them to refresh all of the knowledge and certain skills. So you can, if you are in a turbine and you have access to a turbine, you can, through a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting like this, demonstrate to an instructor that you are able to take an emergency kit, rescue kit, and hook it up and show how it works. So we know that you have that present, right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of level that we're talking about in this online training. But most of the training is scenario-based practical exercises where you have to demonstrate to someone that you can do it, and that's really difficult to do in an online version. That said, we have also simultaneously almost released something we call digital requirements for training providers who wants to go at it and see if they can create virtual versions of the training center, if they can deliver the same learning at the same level of taxonomy, then go at it. Let's do it. Like fire awareness, for instance, is something where you could do this in a virtual reality world. Put on some VR goggles and have a mock thing, and you could do a fire awareness and do some firefighting, right? And that could be almost true to life, and you would get the same kind of learning. So that could work. But climbing a ladder and do it safe via, no, I don't know. But I'm curious to see what happens.
Yeah, well, thank you. And listen, thank you all for the report. It really helped a lot of great information in there. So thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thanks so much, Ross. Thanks so much for your question. We'll now move over to Steve, who has a question. Steve, if you can introduce yourself and ask your question to the panel.
Hi, everyone.
There we go.
Hi, my name's Steve Proud from a company, BPP Cable Solutions. And during the presentation, Ed mentioned that there's been an identified shortage of skilled personnel in the coming years for the offshore wind industry. And I was wondering if there was if it's been identified what skill sets are in short supply, so companies like ourselves are able to give an indication of how many people we need to get trained and put on the GWO training.
Is this a question to me?
It was for Ed, if possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Steve. I mean, it's not something that we specifically looked at with the analysis. So I guess the assumption was that the trained people in Europe are sufficient to meet the European requirement at the moment, and then just to come up with this personnel figure to apply to the other markets. So it wasn't really in scope to sort of look at the roles of the people that are trained, and therefore where there might be shortages in future. So what I'd like to answer your question, it's not really something that we sort of looked at in detail in the report. It is something that I think, as I mentioned, there's I don't want to say limitations particularly, because obviously we stand by the figures, but there are certainly areas for extra research to really refine this number and model the number a bit better. And I think part of that is to understand the trades that all the trained people are in, and I think if we had a bit more data on that, we could not only refine this overall X thousand people required in each market, but I think that the knock-on of that would be to help people like yourselves identify what trades and skills are perhaps in shortage in the future. But it's another piece of work, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. We've got people trained. It's just whether we need to increase that, for the future. But yeah, that's great. Thanks very much for your honest answer there. Cheers.
No worries.
Thanks, Steve. We'll take one last question from Joan, who's on the line. Joan, if you want to introduce yourself and ask your question to the panel.
Hi, Elisa. Hope you can hear me. I'm Joan Bondarev, and I work on offshore wind in Virginia, and also was the former chief counsel of the Maritime Administration. And I've been advocating for them to support offshore wind training at Kings Point, and I'm happy that they've somehow listened to me. But my question today is probably for Liz and Fong, which is what's causing the big delays on the East Coast on these offshore wind projects? Is it permitting? Is it COVID-19? Is it a combination of the two? And what, if anything, can be done about it? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Joan. Nice to see you. Yes, I do believe it's a combination of both things. I want to address federal permitting first, though. As we all know, permitting, the vineyard permit was slowed down due to the fact that they needed to get a cumulative EIS done. It was unclear as to when BOEM would actually move forward with that EIS until I believe it was January that they came out with their very transparent timeframe saying that they would make a decision on that project in December of 2020. The BOEM permitting process is such that it is sequential in that Vineyard was the first in the queue, so to say, and that there were other projects behind it and having their COPs reviewed. So until the Vineyard project is moved out and a decision is made on that, you won't have the other COPs coming out of BOEM. So that has created a delay because when the developers submitted their timelines at the beginning, no one saw in advance that the Vineyard project would hold things up, so to say. I also believe that COVID is having a somewhat of an impact on that, but I do believe that it will. I think there are ways that we can make up the time that we're losing in the future. So I think all in all, we will be on track to do the first 5,000 megawatts in the time frame that both GWEC and the network have forecasted. And I believe that we'll end up with our 10 gigawatts, probably more actually by the end of the decade. So I think we're okay, but those are some of the reasons or some of the reasons behind some of the delays in the US projects. I'm not panicked. So
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate it.
That's good to hear, Liz. Fong, do you have anything to add on to that? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I think she covered this question very well. I mean, right now, only one project under construction right now in the US. So looking at the impact, the situation is different from what we had here in Europe and also in APAC, including China, Vietnam, Taiwan. So looking at the delay, not just not mainly on the construction part, it's really focused on the stage of the permitting and BOEM. That's the bottleneck, so to speak, as the Liz already mentioned. I think that's the true challenge for the US at this moment. Thank you.
Jakob has one last point to make.
Yeah, thanks, John, for the question. And just from my previous job was with the Danish Wind Industry Association, and something that we regularly argued with our government is that if we can create a smooth and fast permitting process, that will help us get some of the jobs, and that has been true. I mean, that is one of the reasons that you see Denmark as one of the leaders in offshore wind and wind in particular, because we have had a very, very smooth permitting process as part of our, let's say, framework conditions for creating an industry in a country. So if you want to get ahead in Virginia, make sure that there's a smooth permitting process as much as possible. And you've understood that, I know.
Thanks,
Thank you very much, Jacob, and everybody.
Thank you so much, Joan. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up the webcast here. If we didn't get to your questions today, feel free to reach out to us at info@gwec.net or info@globalwindsafety.org, and we can answer any further questions you have. If you haven't downloaded the report already, you can scan the QR code here or go to the GWEC or GWO websites and you can download the report there. On behalf of GWEC, GWO, and the Business Network for Offshore Wind, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and all of our panelists as well for joining us today, and wish you a wonderful afternoon or evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.